The sea was silent, unnaturally so. Beneath the calm surface of the Western Pacific, a single American submarine prowled in the dark, her hull vibrating faintly under the steady pulse of the engines. It was mid-1944, the height of the Pacific War, and somewhere above, Japan's merchant convoys were tracing fragile silver wakes across a vast ocean that had suddenly turned hostile. Inside the cramped control room, red lights glowed over sweating faces. Torpedo men whispered coordinates. The captain, a quiet veteran of too many failed patrols, studied the sonar screen, a rhythmic heartbeat of life and death. The Japanese convoy was close now, its escorts unaware that the hunters had learned their patterns, their mathematics, down to the minute. Moments later, the silence was broken by a mechanical hiss. A torpedo left its tube, slicing through the depths with perfect calculation. When the explosion came, it shattered more than steel. It tore at the lifeline of an empire built on sea lanes. And this was only the beginning. When the Pacific War erupted in December 1941, Japan stood as the undisputed naval power of the East. Its navy, the Imperial Japanese Navy, or IJN, was one of the most modern and formidable maritime forces ever assembled. It possessed carriers that had revolutionized naval warfare, cruisers built for speed and range, and a submarine arm designed for reconnaissance and support. But beneath the surface of that might lay a structural weakness, a weakness that would one day become fatal. Japan was an island empire, entirely dependent on maritime supply lines for everything that sustained its war machine. Oil, rubber, steel, food, and men. Every warship that sailed, every aircraft that took flight, every soldier who fought on distant islands relied on merchant convoys crossing vast stretches of ocean. Those thin lines of ships were Japan's arteries, pumping life from Southeast Asia to the home islands. In the early years, those routes seemed secure. Japanese merchant ships steamed confidently across the South China Sea and through the Philippine waters, under the protection of escort destroyers and air patrols. American submarines, although numerous, struggled in the shadows. Their torpedoes, the Mark 14, were faulty, running too deep or failing to explode. Submarine commanders returned from patrols with frustration and disbelief. They had risked everything, closed to perfect range, fired perfect shots, only to watch their weapons strike harmlessly or detonate prematurely. Washington knew of the issue, but bureaucratic inertia and inter-service politics delayed action. The Navy Bureau of Ordnance insisted the weapons were fine, blaming the men instead. It was only after persistent testing in 1943 that the truth was accepted, and the tide began to turn. With corrected torpedoes, better training, and new doctrine, the U.S. submarine force was reborn. The Pacific Ocean became a chessboard, and the Americans were learning to play by new rules. By 1943, Japan's empire stretched from Burma to the Solomon Islands, but every expansion had come at a cost. Its fleet consumed vast amounts of oil, its armies required constant resupply, and its factories back home starved for resources. The Allies knew this. Intelligence intercepts and economic analyses had made it clear. Japan could not sustain its war effort without the steady flow of raw materials from the conquered territories. The American strategy began to shift accordingly. Instead of challenging the mighty Japanese surface fleet head-on, they would strike the unseen, the merchant convoys and tankers feeding that fleet. This change was subtle but decisive. Submarine warfare, once a frustrating sideshow, became a cornerstone of Allied grand strategy in the Pacific. The order was simple: cut the lifeline. American submarines were few, less than 2% of the U.S. Navy's personnel. Yet, they would bear a burden far greater than their numbers suggested. They operated in isolation, often hundreds of miles from support, deep behind enemy lines. Success demanded not only courage, but precision. A cold, mathematical mastery of movement, timing, and geometry. Each submarine patrol became an equation. Position, bearing, speed, angle on the bow, torpedo depth, target's zigzag pattern. Every factor had to be computed mentally or by slide rule, under pressure, with seconds to spare. One mistake could mean a miss or death. By late 1943, the results were beginning to show. Convoys that had once traveled safely began to vanish. Oil tankers from Borneo failed to arrive. The Imperial Japanese Navy's proud merchant fleet was being drained one ship at a time. But it was in 1944 that the campaign reached its most devastating efficiency. That year, the U.S. Navy's submarine arm, under Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, commander of Submarine Force Pacific Fleet, perfected a doctrine that combined aggressive tactics with data-driven precision. Patrol reports were analyzed in detail, kill ratios tracked, and target routes mapped through painstaking intelligence work. Lockwood's staff, using decrypted radio traffic and aerial reconnaissance, identified Japan's crucial shipping corridors. From Singapore to the home islands, through the South China Sea and northward past Formosa. American submarines began to operate in coordinated wolf packs, 3 or 4 boats sharing intelligence and positioning to trap convoys. Each attack was planned with mathematical discipline. Submarine captains studied the geometry of movement, estimating convoy speed from smoke columns or propeller sounds, predicting zigzag intervals, and setting up intercepts with trigonometric precision. For the Japanese, this was a new kind of enemy. Invisible, analytical, relentless. Convoys grew larger, but protection was never enough. Japan's destroyers were stretched thin, their sonar primitive, their radar unreliable. Escort commanders relied on depth charges and instinct. But the ocean was vast, and American submarines were learning to use it like a weapon. They could disappear into thermoclines, temperature layers that bent sonar waves, or slip under the noise of their own explosions to evade detection. By the spring of 1944, U.S. submarines were sinking Japanese ships faster than Japan could replace them. Tankers, freighters, troop ships, it made no difference. Every ship lost was another artery cut. By mid-year, Japan's oil reserves were plummeting. Aircraft training was curtailed. Warships were confined to port to conserve fuel. The great Imperial Navy that had once ranged across the Pacific was now starving, trapped by its own dependence on the sea. The transformation was astonishing. In 1942, Japan had transported more than 40 million tons of cargo across its empire. By late 1944, less than a quarter of that moved successfully. Entire convoys disappeared without a trace. And yet, for all its devastation, the campaign was not driven by hatred or chaos. It was guided by discipline, by mathematics. Submarine commanders like Richard O'Kane of the Tang, Eugene Fluckey of the Barb, and Slade Cutter of the Seahorse became masters of this new form of warfare. They memorized convoy schedules, studied enemy tactics, and struck not at random, but at predictable intervals. Each patrol report read like a technical manual. Target course 90 degrees, range 2,000 yards, torpedo depth 10 feet, gyro angle set. Precision replaced chance. The result was annihilation. Yet the most remarkable aspect was not just how effectively the Americans struck, but how long it took Japan's admirals to comprehend what was happening. Their entire strategic worldview was shaped by the great surface battles they had trained for. Midway, Coral Sea, Leyte. the slow strangulation by submarines was something entirely alien. Even as losses mounted, the Imperial Navy continued to prioritize its capital ships over its merchant fleet. Escort vessels were built too late, convoys too few, and merchant captains sent into waters now ruled by unseen predators. In Tokyo, the Ministry of Transportation reported staggering figures: tonnage losses exceeding 200,000 tons per month. Oil shipments from the Dutch East Indies, once the empire's lifeblood, had dropped by more than 80%. Still, official denial persisted. The Japanese Admiralty believed that submarine warfare alone could not cripple an empire of their size. They were wrong. By the end of 1944, U.S. submarines had reduced Japan's merchant fleet from more than 6 million tons to barely 2. What had begun as a background campaign had become the silent executioner of an empire. And at the center of it all was an extraordinary paradox. An enemy destroyed not by overwhelming numbers, but by precision, calculation, and the quiet determination of a few thousand men beneath the waves. Each torpedo fired, each convoy intercepted, each lifeline cut, all followed from a formula. The war, once ruled by admirals and fleets, was now being rewritten by mathematics. But the story of how that transformation reached its peak, how American submarines perfected a war of numbers so complete that Japanese admirals were left stunned, would unfold in the year that followed. As the lifeline to the south was severed link by link until nothing remained. And that is where the next chapter begins. By early 1944, the Pacific had become a proving ground for a new kind of warfare. Invisible, data-driven, and mercilessly precise. For Japan, the seas that had once been symbols of power and expansion were turning into graveyards. For the United States, each submarine patrol was now part of a calculated system. A campaign designed not merely to sink ships, but to dismantle an entire economy through numbers, distance, and time. The man orchestrating this transformation was Vice Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, known to his men as Uncle Charlie. Moke, unlike many in the higher command, Lockwood understood the submarine service intimately. He had served in boats, knew their constraints, their psychology, and above all, their potential. When he took command of the submarine force, Pacific Fleet, in 1943, he found a demoralized corps. Captains uncertain of their weapons, crews weary of fruitless patrols, and a bureaucracy that undervalued their work. Lockwood changed everything. He listened to his captains, encouraged innovation, and demanded accountability from those who had failed them, particularly the Bureau of Ordnance, whose defective torpedoes had cost countless lives. After months of exhaustive testing and field data collection, the truth became irrefutable. The Mark 14 torpedo, long assumed perfect, was riddled with design flaws, depth-keeping errors, faulty exploders, and unstable magnetic triggers. Lockwood's persistence led to fixes that finally made the weapon reliable. With that single breakthrough, American submarines gained the instrument they needed to execute a mathematically precise war. But Lockwood's brilliance extended beyond engineering. He approached the campaign as an equation, a massive, continent-spanning equation of logistics, geography, and probability. Using intelligence from decrypted Japanese radio messages, the Ultra and Magic programs, his analysts mapped shipping routes across the empire. Patterns emerged. Tankers departing Balikpapan for the home islands followed near-identical schedules. Convoys from Singapore or Saigon moved along predictable paths, constrained by reefs and currents. This data became the basis for what Lockwood called traffic analysis warfare. Each submarine patrol was assigned a sector not by guesswork, but by statistical likelihood. Areas of highest density, the arteries of Japan's maritime life, were saturated with submarines. Crews studied charts until they could visualize the convoys moving through them, almost as though reading the enemy's pulse. The mathematics of interception became second nature. If a convoy steamed at 8 knots on a heading of 030 degrees, a submarine positioned 50 miles ahead at periscope depth could plot an intercept angle to cross its path within hours. Factors such as sea state, thermocline layers, and daylight cycles were folded into every decision. Captains like Richard O'Kane on Tang and Dudley Mush Morton on Wahoo turned those calculations into art forms. Their attacks appeared effortless to outside observers, but behind each success lay dozens of micro-adjustments, gyroscopic corrections, bearing predictions, speed calculations, all done mentally in seconds. By summer 1944, this methodical destruction began to reach terrifying levels of efficiency. The Americans were not simply hunting ships. They were dissecting a living organism. Consider the vital sea lanes through the South China Sea, the empire's main artery linking the oil fields of Borneo and Sumatra with the refineries and factories of Japan. Hundreds of ships plied this route monthly, carrying everything from crude oil and bauxite to rice and troops. Lockwood concentrated his forces here. Submarines operated in rotating patrol lines across the Luzon Strait, forming invisible walls of steel. Each boat reported contact data via encoded messages, and nearby boats adjusted position accordingly. When a convoy appeared, the trap closed with mathematical inevitability. The results were catastrophic. Convoy High 71, for instance, sailed from Singapore in August 1944, bound for Japan with nearly 20,000 troops and vital oil supplies. It never arrived. American submarines Rasher, Bluefish, and Spadefish intercepted it near the Philippines, sinking multiple transports and tankers in coordinated night attacks. More than 5,000 soldiers perished. The Japanese escorts, though numerous, could do little. Radar-equipped submarines struck from beyond visual range, using timing tables to fire spread patterns that maximized probability of hit. This was the new mathematics of war. Not emotion, not chance, but precision. Japanese naval planners struggled to comprehend it. Their doctrine still emphasized decisive fleet engagements, the grand battleship duels that had once defined naval honor. Submarine warfare, in their eyes, was secondary, defensive, almost unworthy of strategic focus. As a result, Japan entered the war with fewer than 30 specialized escort vessels. By contrast, the US and Britain had built hundreds. Even as losses soared, Japanese admirals prioritized the defense of capital ships and carrier task forces, leaving the merchant fleet, the true foundation of their war economy, largely unprotected. The consequences were immediate and irreversible. By late 1944, the Imperial Navy's fuel reserves had fallen so low that major warships like Yamato and Musashi were confined to harbor for months at a time. Air training programs were slashed. Pilots were ordered to practice taxiing rather than flying to conserve fuel. Synthetic oil production failed to bridge the gap. Every tanker sunk was another blow to Japan's ability to fight. The human toll was equally immense. Thousands of sailors, merchantmen, and soldiers vanished into the sea, often with little warning. Survivors reported horrific scenes. Ships split in two by torpedoes, burning oil slicks stretching for miles, and men floating for days before succumbing to exhaustion or sharks. The psychological effect rippled through the empire. Merchant crews, once proud to serve the nation, grew fearful. Convoys left port half empty. Some refused to sail at all. Still, the Japanese command clung to outdated assumptions. They believed that submarine warfare, however painful, could not defeat an empire that still controlled vast territory. But by late 1944, geography was turning against them. The U.S. advanced through the Central Pacific, from the Marshalls to the Marianas, had brought American bases ever closer to the shipping lanes. Submarines now operated from Guam, Saipan, and the Philippines, cutting transit times and increasing patrol frequency. At the same time, Allied air power joined the hunt. Navy patrol bombers equipped with radar and depth charges began to coordinate with submarines, tracking convoys from above and relaying positions by encrypted signal. The combined pressure was unbearable. Japan's admirals found themselves overwhelmed not by superior fleets, but by systems, by an enemy that fused intelligence, technology, and mathematics into one seamless killing machine. By the end of 1944, the numbers told the story in cruel simplicity. Out of 6.3 million tons of merchant shipping Japan had possessed in 1941, less than 1.9 million remained afloat. Oil imports from the Dutch East Indies had fallen from nearly 30 million barrels a year to under 4 million. Steel production had collapsed by half, aircraft output by nearly 2/3. Even food shipments to the home islands were disrupted, leading to rationing and famine warnings. And still, the submarines came. In Tokyo, the grim reports reached the highest levels of command. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, chief of the Naval General Staff, read tonnage loss charts with disbelief. To him, the figures seemed exaggerated. Statistical errors, he thought, or propaganda. But field officers knew better. Their destroyers returned from convoy duty with empty depth charge racks and haunted eyes. The sea was no longer theirs. The Americans had learned to strike with logic so perfect, it bordered on inevitability. Every Japanese convoy route, every timetable, every anchorage had become part of a mathematical pattern. And once the pattern was known, it could be broken. By early 1945, Japan was facing an invisible blockade. The Imperial Navy's proud warships, built to dominate the Pacific, were trapped in their own harbors. They could not sortie, could not refuel, could not save their empire. And the admirals, men trained for grand battles, were left stunned, helpless before an enemy they could not see, whose greatest weapon was understanding itself. The Pacific War had entered its final phase, and the destruction of Japan's lifeline was nearly complete. But to see how the Americans achieved such mechanical precision, how mathematics turned to mastery beneath the waves, we must look closer into the very angles of this silent war. The submarine war against Japan was more than a contest of ships and weapons. It was a war of minds, of systems, and of human endurance. To understand how the Americans achieved such devastating precision, one must look through its different lenses: the human, the tactical, and the technological. Each revealed a layer of mastery that together formed an unstoppable mechanism beneath the sea. The human angle came first, and perhaps it was the most remarkable of all. American submariners lived and fought under conditions few others could endure. The submarines of World War II were small, claustrophobic steel coffins. Temperatures in the Pacific often exceeded 100 degrees inside the hull. Humidity condensed on the bulkheads and dripped constantly. The air grew foul with diesel fumes and sweat. Men slept beside torpedoes or machinery, their rest broken by alarms and explosions. Yet within that confinement, discipline ruled. Every man knew his position. Every movement had purpose. The slightest misstep could mean death. One wrong valve turned, one sound too loud, one moment's panic. Submarine life forged a kind of brotherhood born not of comfort, but of shared silence. Crews learned to communicate with nods, glances, or brief whispers. They trusted their captain completely, because trust was survival. Captains, in turn, carried the burden of decision, to fire, to risk, to dive deeper than design limits when hunted. The psychological strain was immense, but it was channeled into focus. These were not men who relied on luck. They relied on calculation. Every patrol demanded that they turn mathematics into instinct. Many captains had engineering backgrounds. They understood not only tactics, but the geometry of motion. They studied enemy behavior the way a mathematician studies symmetry. When a convoy zigzagged, they predicted the next turn. When sonar pings echoed through the hull, they estimated bearing shifts by ear alone. It was science practiced in darkness. And yet, beyond the math and precision, there was courage. The cold kind that comes from acceptance. Submariners knew that if depth charges found them, there would be no rescue. The ocean gave no second chances. They fought not for glory, but for the belief that every ship sunk brought the war closer to its end. That quiet resolve, multiplied across hundreds of boats, formed the invisible backbone of the Pacific victory. The tactical angle revealed the next layer. How logic and instinct merged into method. Unlike surface warfare, submarine combat was defined by patience. A single attack might require hours of stalking, calculating courses, waiting for the exact geometry to align. Captains maneuvered silently, matching the target's speed to minimize detection. The mathematics of interception was simple on paper, but perilous in practice. Each element, distance, speed, bearing, changed constantly. A 1-degree error could send torpedoes harmlessly past their targets. To solve this, the Americans developed the TDC, the Torpedo Data Computer, a mechanical analog computer that translated inputs from the periscope and sonar into firing solutions in real time. It allowed the captain to track the enemy's course and adjust his own position dynamically. But the TDC was only as good as the man using it. In skilled hands, it turned the submarine into a precision weapon. In untrained ones, it was a distraction. The U.S. Navy invested heavily in training its submarine officers to think mathematically, to interpret patterns faster than machines could compute them. These skills birthed new tactics. The end-around maneuver, in which a submarine surfaced to sprint ahead of a convoy, then submerged again to attack from the front, demanded perfect timing and nerve. Night surface attacks, pioneered by commanders like Dudley Morton and O'Kane, exploited the radar advantage to strike from unexpected angles. Convoys rarely survived such encounters intact. The Japanese, meanwhile, struggled to adapt. Their escort tactics were rigid, based on pre-war doctrine unsuited for fluid, unseen threats. They often used destroyers designed for open ocean battles rather than anti-submarine warfare. Their sonar operators were poorly trained, their depth charge settings too shallow. American submarines learned to exploit these weaknesses. They dived deeper than Japanese sonar could reach, used temperature layers to mask sound, and waited patiently while enemy ships circled above, wasting ammunition and time. Each of these tactical evolutions turned the submarine campaign into an asymmetric chess match, one side governed by calculation, the other by habit. The technological angle was equally critical. By 1944, American submarines were among the most advanced vessels afloat. They carried radar that could detect ships miles away, even in darkness or fog. Sonar systems provided near-constant situational awareness. Radio encryption allowed submarines to coordinate with one another and with command centers on shore. The Mark 18 electric torpedo, introduced that year, left no visible wake. A terrifying innovation, that robbed Japanese lookouts of their last warning. But technology alone did not ensure success. What made it decisive was how seamlessly it integrated with the human and tactical elements. The new radar systems allowed captains to plot convoy courses hours before visual contact. Combined with ultra-intelligence, it turned the Pacific into a transparent ocean for the Americans, one where every movement of the enemy could be predicted with astonishing accuracy. In the submarine bases at Fremantle, Pearl Harbor, and later Guam, intelligence officers compiled convoy prediction charts. These charts listed departure ports, estimated routes, and likely arrival times for every known Japanese convoy. Patrol zones were then assigned to intercept these predicted paths. It was warfare reduced to probability, and probability, refined through experience, became certainty. Even the act of firing torpedoes evolved into a science. Commanders learned to stagger launches, adjusting gyro angles to create overlapping spread patterns that mathematically guaranteed hits regardless of small course errors. They no longer relied on chance. They calculated outcomes. The contrast could not have been greater. While Japan clung to tradition and intuition, the Americans embraced data and feedback loops. Every patrol report was analyzed for trends. Which firing angles produced the most hits, which depths avoided detection, which convoy routes yielded the highest success rates. Within months, Lockwood's headquarters had turned raw reports into statistical models that predicted success with remarkable precision. The effect was cumulative. Each lesson refined the next mission. Each success sharpened the next attack. By mid-1944, the submarine campaign had evolved from chaos into near-mechanical efficiency. For Japan's admirals, this was incomprehensible. Their culture prized individual valor, the decisive sword stroke, the bold maneuver. What they faced now was impersonal, relentless calculation. Their ships were not defeated by superior courage or greater numbers, but by equations written in silence and executed without hesitation. In the space of 3 years, the balance of the Pacific had inverted. The Japanese fleet, once the terror of the ocean, was paralyzed. The Americans, few in number but mathematically precise, had achieved dominance through intellect and adaptation. And yet, there were still other dimensions: leadership, morale, and the moral calculus of waging such a silent war that completed the picture of how the Lifeline was severed so completely. The war beneath the Pacific was as much about leadership and moral endurance as it was about tactics and machines. The submarine force's success, often described in figures and tonnage, had a deeper foundation. The leadership that forged its discipline, the psychology that sustained it, and the moral ambiguity that haunted it. At the center stood Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, the quiet architect of precision warfare. His leadership was not of charisma or grand speeches, but of conviction. Lockwood cultivated trust. He treated every submarine commander as both a warrior and a scientist. When reports came in from patrols, he studied them like research papers, examining firing angles, error margins, and the tactical environment. Mistakes were not condemned. They were analyzed. Successes were shared widely, their methods standardized across the fleet. In this way, Lockwood created a culture of empirical warfare, where experience translated directly into doctrine. He knew his men were operating on the edge, psychologically and physically. After every patrol, he met returning captains personally, often with a cigar and a question. "What did you learn?" That question became a ritual. It was never, "How many did you sink?" but, "What can we improve?" The answer might shape the next mission, the next torpedo setting, the next approach pattern. Under his command, submarine warfare evolved from instinct to system. Crews began keeping mathematical logs during attacks, recording data to analyze later. Engineers recalibrated instruments based on field performance rather than laboratory assumptions. The entire force became a living laboratory, a network of minds refining the geometry of destruction. But Lockwood also carried the burden of conscience. He knew that precision, once perfected, left little room for mercy. Submarines did not fight battles in the traditional sense. They executed them. When a torpedo found its target, the result was instant. Steel torn open, oil ignited, hundreds lost in seconds. The submariners heard the sounds through the hull, the explosions, the collapsing metal, the screams fading into static through the sonar. Some captains ordered the periscope lowered rather than watch. Others stared silently, knowing that their purpose left no space for hesitation. This was the moral angle of the campaign, the quiet reckoning that came with success. The Americans had turned warfare into a science, but science does not grieve. Every sunk convoy meant fewer Japanese soldiers reaching the front, fewer bombs falling on Allied lines. But it also meant thousands of lives extinguished unseen. The men of the submarine service understood this paradox deeply. They celebrated survival, not destruction. Their triumphs were recorded in tonnage, but their victories were always followed by silence. For the Japanese, the moral equation was reversed. In their doctrine, to die at sea for the emperor was honorable, even beautiful. But the scale of their losses defied belief. Convoy after convoy vanished without warning. There were no epic surface battles, no glorious last stands, only sudden eruptions of fire, then nothing. The ocean swallowed entire regiments, supplies, and dreams. Survivors, if any, drifted for days before rescue. Some ships carried prisoners of war or civilians, others carried soldiers who never even knew they were under attack until the water rushed in. The sea became Japan's cemetery. Inside Tokyo's naval offices, the sense of helplessness deepened. Admiral Toyota and his staff tried to organize new defensive strategies. Convoy routes along the Chinese coast, increased air patrols, emergency escort programs. But every initiative was too little, too late. The industrial heart of Japan could no longer sustain production. Merchant shipbuilding had fallen behind losses, and fuel shortages crippled even the remaining fleet's ability to operate. What began as a tactical nuisance had become a national catastrophe. And yet, there was a strange respect growing beneath the hatred. Interrogations after the war revealed that many Japanese officers privately admired the efficiency of the American submarine force. They spoke of its mathematical mastery, its discipline, its cold professionalism. To them, it was the ultimate realization of Bushido's precision. But stripped of ritual, focused entirely on results. It was a mirror they could not bear to face. The leadership angle also extended to the individual commanders who turned Lockwood's doctrine into action. Men like Richard O'Kane, Slade Cutter, Eugene Fluckey, and Sam Dealey became legends not because of recklessness, but because of calculation. They studied charts as if studying enemy psychology. They anticipated not just where convoys were, but where they would be hours later. Each attack was a lesson in applied geometry. O'Kane's rule was simple. If you can't get closer, get smarter. Eugene Fluckey's USS Barb epitomized this blend of intellect and audacity. On one patrol, Fluckey analyzed convoy intervals so precisely that he surfaced at night in the middle of an anchorage, fired torpedoes, and escaped through chaos. a maneuver that defied conventional safety but relied entirely on timing equations. His patrol reports read like scientific documents. Ranges, bearings, rates of turn, calculated torpedo run times to fractions of a second. He sank entire convoys, then summarized his actions in calm, analytical language. What these commanders shared was not recklessness, but faith. In their calculations, in their crews, and in the data that guided them. Each success validated the method. Each loss refined it. By 1945, the submarine service had become an ecosystem of shared knowledge. No attack was isolated. No success belonged to one man alone. Yet beneath the precision lay an emotional cost rarely spoken of. Many submariners, after the war, found it difficult to reconcile the quiet intensity of their missions with civilian life. They had lived by numbers, bearing, range, speed. Where a mistake meant death, they had learned to suppress emotion so completely that even victory felt empty. Some described surfacing after a successful attack to see oil fires on the horizon and feeling nothing but exhaustion. The moral question of the submarine campaign: whether such total precision could coexist with humanity, lingered long after the guns fell silent. But during the war, those doubts were buried under necessity. To the men aboard the boats, survival was justification enough. They fought in darkness so that others would not have to. In the grand view, however, their campaign raised a question that would define the modern era. When war becomes a matter of calculation, does it also become inevitable? The American submariners proved that intellect could triumph over material might, that precision could dismantle an empire. But in doing so, they also demonstrated how war itself was evolving. Strategy was no longer ruled by passion or bravery, but by information and numbers. A shift that would echo through every conflict to come. By early 1945, this transformation was complete. Japan's admirals were no longer fighting a navy. They were fighting an equation they could not solve. The sea that had once given them life now betrayed them, mapped and measured by their enemies. And soon, that equation would reach its climax. The point where the lifeline would be severed completely, where mathematics would become destruction, and where the stunned silence of Japanese command would mark the moment the empire's fate was sealed. Spring, 1945. The Pacific was collapsing inward. The once proud arteries of the Japanese Empire, the shipping lanes stretching from Sumatra to Formosa, now pulsed faintly, irregularly, like a dying heart. On every route, unseen hunters waited below the waves. American submarines no longer searched for targets. They managed them. The ocean had become an organized battlefield, mapped by mathematics and controlled by will. From the cold waters off Luzon to the narrow straits of the South China Sea, the killing ground was total. Submarines operated not in isolation, but in coordinated wolf packs, a term borrowed from the Germans, perfected by the Americans. Each boat was a node in a precise network. When one found a convoy, it sent coded bursts through radio silence, guiding others to intercept points calculated with near geometric accuracy. By the time Japanese ships realized they were being tracked, the net had already closed. The result was devastating. Convoy HI-88A, one of the last major efforts to transport oil from Sumatra to Japan, departed in mid-1944 with 8 tankers under heavy escort. Within days, radar blips appeared on the scopes of the USS Flasher and USS Hawkbill. The American commanders analyzed their speed and course, plotting an intercept using only a pencil and slide rule. In darkness, they attacked from 2 sides. 6 torpedoes fired, 5 hits confirmed. Tankers erupted in sheets of flame that turned the sea into a burning plain. By dawn, half the convoy was gone. The survivors limped away under smoke, leaving oil slicks stretching for miles. This was no longer war by chance. It was war by calculation. Each sinking reduced Japan's ability to move oil, or men. Each success reinforced the precision model Lockwood had built, a system of observation, data sharing, and adaptive execution. By late 1944, Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, faced an impossible equation. His fleet required at least 1.2 million tons of oil per month to operate. Submarine reports from Tokyo's intelligence division estimated that less than 200,000 tons were arriving. Destroyers could not sail. Carriers lay motionless in harbors. Air bases rationed fuel to the last liter. The Imperial Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, was now paralyzed not by superior guns or planes, but by absence. The silent precision of American submarines. In January 1945, the crisis reached its peak. The Japanese High Command ordered a desperate convoy, Operation Tama 37, to transport fuel from Singapore to the home islands. It was escorted by destroyers and aircraft, its route adjusted daily to avoid detection. But mathematics had already doomed it. At Pearl Harbor, Lockwood's staff plotted its likely path using recent intercept patterns. 3 submarines were positioned along predicted vectors: USS Ceylon, USS Hackleback, and USS Creval. On the night of January 15th, sonar pings echoed faintly in the dark waters off the Gulf of Siam. The Sea Lion's commander, Eli Reich, studied his instruments. He knew the convoy would cross his path within minutes. Using radar and hydrophone data, he computed speed, distance, and bearing, then fired a spread of torpedoes, adjusted for the convoy's evasive zigzag. The timing was perfect. 2 tankers exploded in brilliant fireballs. A third listed heavily and sank within an hour. As flames climbed the night sky, Reich's voice was calm. "Another lifeline cut," he recorded in his log. His calculations had taken less than 5 minutes. Back in Tokyo, reports arrived with disbelief. The convoy had been annihilated despite its precautions. Toyota's operations staff pored over charts, unable to understand how American submarines always appeared in the right place at the right time. One officer reportedly muttered, "They must see through the sea itself." By then, the precision was almost supernatural, but it was entirely human. It came from relentless pattern analysis, data cross-referencing, and discipline. American intelligence teams at Pearl Harbor and Fremantle tracked convoy routes through ultra-decrypts, radio triangulation, and intercepted weather reports. Submarine captains received only fragments of information, but their experience turned those fragments into certainty. The Pacific, vast and chaotic, had been transformed into a mathematical grid. In the South China Sea, Richard O'Kane's USS Tang executed one of the most destructive patrols in naval history. Using radar-assisted fire control, O'Kane calculated torpedo trajectories so precisely that he sometimes fired at unseen targets, trusting only his numbers. In just one patrol, he sank 10 ships totaling more than 40,000 tons. His success rate bordered on the unbelievable until his final torpedo malfunctioned and circled back, striking his own vessel. Even in tragedy, precision remained the defining force. By March 1945, Japan's merchant fleet had been reduced from over 6 million tons to less than 1 million. The empire that once spanned half the Pacific now struggled to feed itself. Coal shipments from Korea stopped. Rice convoys from Indochina never arrived. The military rationed fuel to the point that some training aircraft were towed to runways by oxen. In harbors across Japan, admirals stared at maps covered in red lines, routes marked lost, unusable, mined, patrolled. The sea that had once been their greatest strength now mocked them with its emptiness. The climax of this campaign was not a single battle, but a revelation. Japan's war machine no longer existed. It had been dismantled by invisible forces, by logic, patience, and mathematics. The submariners had cut the veins of an empire with surgical precision. And yet, even as American captains returned from their final patrols, their triumphs carried a strange solemnity. They had won not through glory or confrontation, but through numbers and cold perfection. Their victory was quiet, their achievement immense, and its full weight would only be understood in the stunned silence of their enemies. In Tokyo, that silence deepened as realization dawned. The Admiralty, once obsessed with battleships and heroism, now faced the end of its oceanic lifeline. There would be no resupply, no recovery. The empire had been defeated not by armies, but by equations. By April 1945, Japan's merchant fleet was no longer a fleet. It was a graveyard of twisted metal and oil-slicked seas. What remained of the empire's shipping drifted in fragments. A few battered tankers, escorted by destroyers with empty fuel tanks, crawling through fog and darkness in the desperate hope of reaching home. Every voyage was a gamble. Every horizon hid a periscope. The American submarine campaign had reached its zenith, not in noise or spectacle, but in silence. The Pacific had turned against Japan entirely. The submariners' tactics, once experimental, now functioned with mechanical perfection. Each patrol was a precise operation. Detection, positioning, computation, and execution. Nothing was random anymore. In the waters off Okinawa, USS Tirante under Lieutenant Commander George L. Street prepared for one of the final, decisive blows. It was April 14th, 1945. The submarine lay motionless, engine silent, less than 2 miles off the Japanese coast, a maneuver considered suicidal. Through the periscope, Street spotted a convoy assembling under cover of darkness. 2 large transports and their escorts, unaware that death waited just beneath the waves. Street ran the numbers. He knew the harbor's depth, the ship's average speed, and the interval between their movements. Using radar range and tidal current data, he calculated a perfect firing solution, down to the second. 3 torpedoes streaked toward their targets. Seconds later, the night erupted in thunder. A massive explosion engulfed the lead transport, followed by secondary blasts as ammunition ignited. The shockwave rolled across the bay, rattling even the Tirante's hull. Street turned calmly to his crew. "We're done here," he said. The submarine slipped away, unseen. His log entry that night was brief. 2 ships destroyed. Harbor secured, withdrew undetected. It was one more incision in the lifeline, another artery cut with absolute precision. At the same time, across the South China Sea, the USS Barb, commanded by Eugene Fluckey, was redefining what submarine warfare could achieve. Fluckey's approach was pure mathematics, turned into art. He tracked convoys using radio intercepts, plotted their intervals by time-distance graphs, and used moonlight refraction charts to determine his surfacing points. His method combined geometry, physics, and instinct. A new form of warfare that merged intellect with daring. In January 1945, during one of his most famous operations, Fluckey located a convoy of 30 ships anchored in Namquan Harbor, China, deep inside enemy waters. Navigating through minefields and shallow tides, he surfaced inside the anchorage at night. The crew fired a spread of torpedoes that struck multiple targets simultaneously. In a single attack lasting minutes, Barb sank 4 ships and escaped under heavy fire. The precision of the timing and targeting was unprecedented. When Fluckey reported back, his summary was clinical. All torpedoes hit within expected deviation limits. By this point, even Japanese intelligence officers began describing American submarines as machines of logic. The reports arriving in Tokyo described losses occurring exactly on schedule. Every convoy destroyed at predictable intervals, every route systematically sealed. One admiral, in a rare moment of despair, said, "They no longer fight. They calculate for the Japanese Navy." This realization was unbearable. Their own doctrines had emphasized courage, faith, and sacrifice, the human spirit as the decisive weapon. But courage could not solve equations. No matter how valiantly they sailed, their convoys were found, tracked, and annihilated. It was not just defeat, it was exposure. The enemy had mastered a level of precision that rendered bravery irrelevant. In June 1945, the Empire's shipping routes were mathematically erased. Of the 6 million tons of merchant shipping Japan possessed in 1941, less than 500,000 tons remained operational. Nearly all oil transport was gone. Even the great industrial cities, Osaka, Yokohama, Nagoya, were running dry. Factories stood silent for lack of fuel. Warships were moored permanently in port, their tanks empty. Japan's military power had been reduced to theory. At Admiral Toyoda's headquarters, the situation was discussed in hushed tones. No one dared to say it aloud, but the numbers spoke clearly. Without oil, the Navy was dead. Without shipping, the Army was stranded across Asia. Without supplies, the Empire was finished. Toyota stared at the maps for long minutes. Every line that had once represented movement, oil from Borneo, steel from China, rice from Indochina, now ended in red ink. Losses, gaps, silence. He ordered one final convoy, a symbolic attempt to show that Japan still had control of its seas. It never arrived. Somewhere between Formosa and Kyushu, it vanished without trace. American patrols found the wreckage days later. In the following weeks, as Allied forces closed in on Okinawa and the Japanese mainland, the Admiralty received its last intelligence briefing. The chart was simple, a skeletal map of East Asia. The logistics officer, his voice barely steady, announced, "Zero oil reserves, no active convoys, merchant fleet, operationally extinct." The silence that followed was total. For men who had built their lives upon the sea, it was the silence of realization that the Empire's fate had been sealed not by great battles, but by invisible mathematics conducted beneath the waves. American submariners, meanwhile, began returning home. Their patrol logs were precise records of efficiency. Targets, tonnage, attack data. They had sunk over 1,100 enemy ships, nearly 55% of Japan's total losses, with barely 2% of the U.S. Navy's manpower. It was one of the most disproportionate campaigns in military history. Admiral Lockwood received the final reports with a quiet nod. His work was done. The system he had built, based on trust, data, and precision, had achieved what fleets of battleships could not. As Japan's remaining admirals stared at their empty charts, one truth became undeniable. The Empire had been defeated not by superior numbers, not by overwhelming firepower, but by intellect. The ocean had turned into a grid of inevitability. Every path led to destruction. And in that silence, as ships vanished, as fuel tanks ran dry, as harbors filled with ghosts, the stunned Japanese command finally understood the phrase whispered among American crews: "We don't guess. We calculate. When the guns of the Pacific finally fell silent in August 1945, the scale of what the submariners had accomplished came into focus. Japan's cities lay in ruins from the air, but long before the bombers arrived, the empire had already been strangled beneath the waves. The submarine campaign had not merely reduced Japan's lifelines, it had erased them. In total, U.S. submarines had sunk more than 1,100 Japanese merchant ships and nearly 200 naval vessels, accounting for over 5 million tons of shipping. It was a record unmatched in modern naval history. With less than 2% of the Navy's total manpower, the submarine force had delivered over half of Japan's maritime losses. The impact was systemic, silent, invisible, and total. Factories shut down not because they were bombed, but because fuel never arrived. Aircraft sat useless on runways, their tanks dry. Soldiers across China, Burma, and the Pacific Islands were stranded, unable to return home or receive supplies. Japan's far-flung empire collapsed not by assault, but by isolation. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, reflecting after the war, described the submarines as a weapon that fought without face or warning. In Tokyo's post-war reports, analysts concluded that the destruction of merchant shipping had been the decisive factor in Japan's defeat. The irony was sharp. The Imperial Navy had invested its faith in battleships and aircraft carriers, believing the ocean could be conquered through grandeur. Instead, it was lost to small steel predators working in silence. For the Americans, the victory was scientific as much as strategic. The submarine force had turned warfare into a data-driven discipline. Every patrol produced new information on enemy movement, torpedo behavior, sonar performance. Lessons were collected, processed, and shared across commands. Lockwood's staff turned war into a form of feedback loop, refining tactics in real time. The result was precision without precedent. Submarine commanders were no longer hunters guided by instinct. They were mathematicians of destruction. They plotted solutions, corrected deviations, and tested hypotheses under fire. The Pacific became their laboratory, and the experiment's outcome was the dissection of an empire. When Japan surrendered, the remnants of its once mighty merchant fleet were scattered wrecks. Hulls rusting in shallow harbors, half-sunken silhouettes off Luzon, Okinawa, and the South China Sea. American naval photographers recorded the devastation in grim silence. Burned tankers spilling oil into the waves, freighters lying broken on coral reefs. Each one was a ghost in the empire's vanished supply chain. At sea, the contrast was almost spiritual. Submariners returning home from their final patrols stepped onto American soil with no fanfare. There were no parades or trumpets. Their victories had been unseen, fought in darkness, recorded only in logs and tonnage charts. Many found it difficult to explain what they had done. They had fought a war few civilians even understood. Some returned to Pearl Harbor and saw the same docks where their first patrols had begun years earlier. The men were older now, faces lined, eyes hardened by what they had witnessed through periscopes. They remembered the silent explosions, the ships breaking apart, the Black Sea swallowing thousands. Even in triumph, they carried an unspoken burden. For every sunken enemy convoy, there were moments that haunted them. The cries faintly heard through steel, the sight of survivors clinging to debris, the understanding that precision had stripped war of its illusions. Victory had not been glorious. It had been clinical. Still, there was a quiet pride, not in destruction, but in accomplishment. They had achieved what grand fleets and massive armies could not. With fewer than 300 submarines, the United States had broken the back of a maritime empire that had ruled the Pacific for decades. The admirals in Washington called it the perfect campaign. But the men who had lived it knew better. Perfection had a price, and that price they would carry in silence. Their work had ended the Empire's reach, yet, as the peace settled across the Pacific, the question began to form. What had this precision truly achieved? And what had it changed in the nature of war itself? In the months following Japan's surrender, the full magnitude of the submarine campaign became a matter of record, study, and awe. Reports from Tokyo's surviving ministries painted a picture of logistical annihilation, an economy and a military dissected with surgical precision. Japan had begun the war with one of the world's largest merchant fleets, over 6 million tons of shipping, capable of sustaining its empire across thousands of miles of ocean. By 1945, less than 500,000 tons remained afloat, most of it immobilized by fuel shortages or damage. The rest lay scattered across the Pacific floor. Entire trade routes had ceased to exist. The once bustling lanes from Borneo to Yokohama, from Formosa to Kobe, were now silent stretches of empty sea. Post-war analysis by Japan's Naval General Staff confirmed what Admiral Lockwood and his commanders had long understood. That once the submarines learned to apply logic, data, and geometry to the chaos of the ocean, Japan's defeat became inevitable. The empire had been built on maritime lifelines, and those lifelines had been mapped, measured, and mathematically erased. For the Japanese admirals who survived, the shock was both professional and existential. They had believed in visibility, in the power of fleets, of steel, of spectacle. They had placed faith in what they could see: carriers, battleships, guns. The Americans had placed faith in what they could calculate. When interviewed after the war, several officers admitted that they had underestimated what mathematics could do when merged with discipline. One senior staff officer confessed, "We had no defense against numbers." The American Navy, meanwhile, began a quiet process of reflection. In Washington, the Submarine Operations Research Group compiled exhaustive studies of every patrol, analyzing attack geometry, torpedo performance, and probability of detection. What they discovered would redefine naval warfare for generations. They found that precision, not force, had been the decisive factor. Success had come from understanding patterns, predicting motion, and using data as a weapon. The submariners' methods would become the foundation of post-war strategy, influencing everything from sonar development to ballistic missile targeting. But the men themselves, the ones who had lived it, carried their own reckonings. Many submariners spoke little of the war after returning home. Their memories were of confined metal spaces, the smell of diesel, the creak of steel under depth charge pressure, and the eerie silence after a successful strike. For them, the ocean would never again be simply blue. It would always be a place of ghosts, of ships and souls that had vanished unseen. Eugene Fluckey, one of the most decorated commanders, later wrote that the greatest weapon a submarine had was not its torpedoes, but the minds of the men who understood how to use them. His words summarize the essence of the campaign: intellect as artillery, logic as firepower. Admiral Lockwood, too, remained humble about the victory. When asked how the U.S. submarine force had achieved such dominance, he replied simply, "We learned from our mistakes faster than the enemy did." That, more than technology or numbers, defined the precision that stunned Japan's admirals. In Tokyo, the lessons were bitter. Surviving officers studying post-war American tactics realized how fully their system had been outthought. Their convoys had sailed on predictable schedules, their routing tables were used, their radio codes cracked. The Americans had not just hunted ships, They had hunted habits. Every oversight, every repeated pattern had become a point on a graph. And that graph had become a death sentence. The sea, which had once carried Japan's empire to glory, had turned against it with mechanical indifference. Oil, steel, rice, soldiers. Everything depended on movement. Once movement stopped, the empire died standing still. By the war's end, 52 American submarines had been lost, along with 3,500 men, about 1 in 5 of those who served. Their sacrifice had purchased the paralysis of an empire. Their names were carved into memorials, but their true monument lay beneath the water, in the silent wrecks that marked the routes they had closed forever. As the Pacific calmed, the logic of that war lingered. The age of battleships had ended. The age of precision had begun. And in that new era, every admiral, Japanese or American, understood the same truth. In modern war, power no longer belonged to those who could strike the hardest, but to those who could calculate the fastest. When the war ended, the Pacific returned to stillness. A vast, indifferent expanse covering the remnants of empires and ambitions. Beneath its surface lay the rusting remains of Japan's Lifeline, each ship a silent testament to the precision that had undone a nation built on the sea. For the submariners who waged that unseen campaign, victory was not triumphant. It was quiet, heavy, and deeply human. They had proven that intellect could overpower might, that patience could suffocate empires, and that numbers, wielded by disciplined minds, could rewrite the nature of warfare itself. Yet they also carried the burden of that knowledge. They had reduced war to a science, and in doing so, stripped it of illusion. The stunned Japanese admirals who once ruled the Pacific had learned that the greatest enemy was not visible across the horizon, but invisible beneath it, unseen, unheard, and unstoppable. Their fleets had perished not in glorious battle, but in equations solved beneath the waves. The realization marked a turning point in human history. The moment war became data-driven, where destruction could be predicted, plotted, and perfected. In the years that followed, nations would study what the submarine force had done, how a small group of men, operating in silence, had dismantled an empire through logic alone. The lessons of that campaign would echo into the Cold War, into computers, missiles, and the age of automation, a legacy born from the math of war. But for those who had lived it, the memory was simpler. They remembered the hum of engines, the scent of oil, the long hours in darkness waiting for a blip on the sonar that meant life or death. They remembered the stillness after the explosion, when the ocean swallowed another ship and the only sound was the ticking of the instruments. In that silence lay the essence of their war, not glory, not rage, but precision. The kind that changed the world without ever raising its voice. And as the waves rolled once more over the quiet wrecks of the Pacific, they carried with them the final truth of that campaign. That empires fall not only by fire, but by calculation. That the sea remembers everything,